East Coast. It is 11:21 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States. And if you're visiting from somewhere else in the world, I am not sure what time it is where you are. But this is Question Authority, and this is going to be a short stream. And the title of this stream is Wall Street is Your New Landlord. Now, we have seen since probably April 2020, massive lockdowns started to be put into place in the United States, and more than half of the world was put under lockdown. The coronavirus hit, a very deadly disease started to spread, very easily transmissible, and they told us to stay inside of our homes and to stay away from each other. And the government said, hey, we're going to take care of you. Now, unfortunately, we live in a predatory capitalist system where every crisis is seen as an opportunity to grab and hoard more wealth from the mass of people and hoard it all the way up, right up at the tippy top. So we have an issue now in our country where more than 6 million people are facing eviction. We saw back in 2008 when the housing market bubble popped, no one was prosecuted for gambling with your home. Now, instead of trying to explain this very complicated issue, what I'm going to do is just start with the topic of the stream. This is from Daily Veracity, and unfortunately today I have some sources from magazines that I really do not like. But for the sake of time and expediency, we're going to pull the facts that we can from these mainstream media outlets, and we're going to point out the hypocrisy as we go along. So, USA Today did several articles on the eviction crisis, and I'm going to just skim through some highlighted sections. Before we get into that, we do have an article here from Daily Veracity, and the article is titled Corporations like BlackRock are buying up thousands of homes, pricing Americans out of the market. So, according to a recent report from the Wall Street Journal, roughly 200 investment firms are buying tens of thousands of homes and sometimes entire neighborhoods, raising prices and competing with middle class Americans looking to take advantage of lower interest rates and buy their first home. Over the past several months, investors made up to 25% of home purchases. In 2012, the federal government launched a program that allowed corporations to easily purchase foreclosed homes by the thousands from Fannie Mae. The corporations then rented out the homes, creating more housing in areas heavily hit by foreclosures. Between 2011 and 2017, some of the world's largest hedge funds spent billions of dollars on almost 250,000 homes. In parts of Atlanta, they bought almost 90% of the 7,500 homes sold between January 2011 and June 2012. Now, why am I bringing this up? When they talk about the eviction crisis, a lot of times what is highlighted is these poor mom and pop renters or landlords. These poor people who just own a single property and rent to people who need it, and they're struggling because they can't collect the income that they expect. But the problem is, the culprit in most cases is not your mom and pop landlord. It is a large corporation and part of the system of rapacious oligarchy that seeks to corner every market in this country and funnel the wealth to the top 1/10 of 1% of society, leaving us all on the ground to struggle and fight over scraps. So, who owns rental properties and is it changing? This is from the Harvard EDU, Housing Perspectives, Research Trends and Perspective of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. This is Hyeon Young Lee, and he is a postdoctoral fellow at the center. So he wrote an article about how the housing market has been changing. So individual investors own a growing share of the nation's 22.5 million rental properties and a majority of the 47.5 million units contained in those properties, according to the U.S. Census Bureau's recently released 2015 Rental Housing Finance Survey. The changes are notable because virtually all of the household growth since the financial crisis has occurred in rental units, with more than half of the growth occurring in single-family rental units. So single-family rental units still have a large portion of individual investors owning those properties. The problem is when you get to 2, 3, 4, 5, 50 or more units, the story changes very, very considerably. Now, you might say, I've seen an article from one of these terrible organizations like The Atlantic that says renting is terrible, owning is worse. Or the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos rag, says forget owning. Renting is becoming the end game for many millennials and baby boomers. Renting is cool. Just rent for the rest of your life and don't own anything. Something about that seems a little bit fishy. Here we have mymove.com. Why millennials are renting more and why it works for them. And all of these articles are propaganda. Why are they propaganda, do you say? Well, let's take a look here. Oh, and then, of course, money under 30. Renting is not wasted money. Why you shouldn't be in a rush to buy a home? Well, we have a gigantic corporation here, a culprit for many evils in the world. The company is called Blackstone. Blackstone bets $6 billion on buying and renting homes. Deal for Home Partners of America, owner of over 17,000 houses in the U.S., is the latest sign that Wall Street believes the housing market will stay hot. And let's go back to the article here. Oh, here we go. Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro stood out on Thursday as one of the few people defending investment firm BlackRock after reports revealed their investments are driving up prices in the housing market. Now, right now, the housing market is incredibly expensive. It is very, very difficult for an average person to buy a home, even though interest rates are at an all time low. So, getting a mortgage, you don't have to pay as high of an interest rate as you typically would have. But gigantic corporations are trying to step in and corner the market so that you will never be able to drag yourself out of poverty. So let's get into this USA Today article. An epidemic in itself, why billions of federal aid isn't making it to renters, landlords during the pandemic. I think it was 46 point something billion dollars that was allocated during the CARES Act. That was one of the largest upward transfers of wealth to the top 1/10 of 1% of people in this country, using different tactics like tax breaks, writing off old losses from businesses, and different tools and mechanisms that the rich can use to make more money and stay rich while the rest of the country struggles. This society does not take care of its poor. It only cares for the people who donate to these very expensive political campaigns. Federal moratoriums on evictions, including a new targeted moratorium the Biden administration issued August 3rd, have protected Calabero from losing his home. So who's Calabero? He's a guy, he's 36, lives with his 9-year-old daughter in a $2,185 a month apartment. He lost 90% of his clients when the pandemic hit and was soon one of the estimated 6 million Americans unable to pay rent during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit and everyone had to lock into their homes, we saw celebrities, rich people, get on their Instagrams and their video streaming platforms and sing us songs and try and comfort us through this difficult time while they lived comfortable in their castles. This was seen as a very tone deaf and very cynical thing by most people who are just normal, everyday working people, but they felt really, really good about themselves for doing it, I'm sure. And also, we heard the media start to applaud and talk about the essential workers, the people who work in grocery stores and the people who work in your local CVS or your local Walgreens. Just regular people who risked getting COVID to go into work so that you could buy your groceries and things like that. The problem is a lot of those people are already living paycheck to paycheck. The income inequality in this country has been unbelievable for decades, if not since the very beginning and founding of this country. So now we have an issue where evictions of more than 6 million people are going to take place. But what has been the story throughout the entire time? Well, landlords skirted the eviction bans from the very beginning, using intimidation and tricks to boot tenants. Cash-strapped renters nationwide say their landlords tried to skirt COVID-19 eviction moratoriums by changing locks, removing trash containers so waste piled up, and in one case attempting to unbolt the front door right off an apartment. Like Heidi Stark, who lost her job due to the pandemic and fell behind on rent, they assumed they were protected, but Stark and her landlord found an end run to Wisconsin's eviction ban. Instead of starting a court process, he sent her a notice to vacate this summer because he was not renewing her lease. These bills that they passed, and this is one reason why we fight for universal fixes to our societal woes. And then we always get the blowback that, oh, well, people who don't really need this aid are going to take advantage of it, so we shouldn't help anybody. The problem is that the red tape involved in something like this, like $46.5 billion allocated for rent, should have been enough to help everyone who is behind on their rent, struggling in this country. The problem is they gave the landlords most of the power in whether or not they would even receive these funds. So in order to receive the aid that was handed out or allocated by the CARES Act, the landlord has to sign off on it as well. And in most cases, these landlords are gigantic corporations. Not to mention that it's very hard to even obtain a rental property. So someone like myself, me and my wife, we're looking for rent. We were looking for a new apartment a few months ago, and we checked 2 or 3 or 4 different places, all owned by giant corporations, all owned by investment firms. We filled out the application process, and they all came back denied. Why? Well, for a couple of different reasons. One is that I have a criminal record. No violent crimes, all misdemeanors. I served my time. I paid off a massive, massive amount of restitution and fines and fees. Over $20,000, I think, for petty theft that may have added up to maybe $2,000 or $3,000 at the very, very most. So, why couldn't I get an apartment? Well, because I have a criminal record. So instead of dealing with regular people, which is who I deal with now, because we finally did find a place that we really liked. And luckily, it was one out of many, many, many different rental properties that we could have gone to that was not owned by a giant corporation. These corporations, they don't care if you're a good person, if you're a productive member of society, if you work, maybe you made some mistakes in your past. They look at the black and white that's on a piece of paper and they decide whether they're going to approve you or deny you based off of that. So it's hard even to rent a property if you have anything but a spotless record. And then there's the credit check system. And if you think credit scores are bad, go ahead and keep applauding authoritarianism in our society. Keep applauding the decrease in our liberties and our freedoms of speech and our rights to protest. Keep applauding authoritarian measures, because what we will see eventually is not just a credit score based on your financial history. We're going to see a social credit score that will determine whether or not you're able to participate in society based off of whatever the ruling class wants to label you as. Are you a obedient servant and a sheep, or are you a person who colors outside the lines? Are you a person that doesn't see eye to eye with your ruling oligarchs? Well, they will find a way to push you to the margins of society and make your life increasingly more and more difficult. But let's talk about the people that already have homes, people that already rent. Because we saw in 2008, many, many people get kicked out of their homes. They did the same fucking thing then. They told people not to pay their mortgages because the let me do some research on this before I start speaking without knowing what I'm talking about. If you want to, this topic is actually very well discussed by a man named Graham Elwood, who was kicked out of his home, told not to pay his mortgage, and then they found a way to boot him from his property. The problem for these guys is that so many people already own homes. All these poor and unwashed masses, they already own these properties. We have to find a way to drag them out, kicking and screaming, so we can buy up everything and then force them to pay a premium for our services. So back to this USA Today article. And of course, the USA Today, without any sense of irony, shows this. So here we have Ryan Grimm, a boring tool of the establishment, a man who pretends to be progressive while propping up the second ratchet, the second funnel to funnel progressives into the Democratic Party, to the DNC, a rapacious corporation that is funded by the upper echelons of our society and does their bidding. Ryan Grimm is standing here with Cori Bush and AOC. We've done a lot on Cori Bush and AOC in the past, and we're not going to relitigate their feckless ineffectiveness. But let's take a look at what Cori Bush and Elizabeth Warren have now proposed to Congress. They'll introduce a bill, and this is from USA Today again, to give HHS power to impose eviction moratoriums. Sounds great, right? Let's take a look at the bill. So everything sounds good. Everything here, it says that they'll implement a national residential eviction moratorium to reduce the introduction, transmission, and spread of COVID-19 and otherwise address the public health emergency declared under Section 319 of such act with respect to COVID. The moratorium under such section shall be automatic without requiring individuals to apply for coverage and apply to all residential eviction filings, hearings, judgments, and execution of judgments, except that the Secretary of Health and Human Services may establish moratorium exceptions necessary to protect the health and safety of others. So there's a little bit of a loophole there. And there was a loophole in the original eviction moratorium that allowed landlords to not only just use intimidation tactics to get rid of undesirables, but also it forced the landlords to sign off on even receiving the rent. So that meant that they could kick out whoever they fucking wanted whenever they wanted to and refuse the money that was allocated by the government. Much of what our government does, much of what our politicians do, it is kabuki theater. It is just a show to make us not rise up and resist, to make us not grow in large numbers and go down to Washington, D.C. every weekend and protest these terrible tools of authoritarianism that seek to hold the 99.9% of people in this country in a stranglehold and hold them captive to pay a premium for societal services, to behave and always do exactly what they want us to do. And the subtle propaganda of the mainstream media reinforces this and forces people to fight against their own self-interest, against each other when they raise questions about these policies, and they raise questions about their leaders and their ineffectiveness and their feckless games and their plays for power, only seeking to improve their own material conditions and serve themselves and their bosses, the oligarchs who run and own this country. So they proposed legislation, which very likely will not pass, but it sounds like they're trying to do something good, because look in this USA Today article. Of course, we have these guys here standing outside of the Capitol building, and we know now that that was a performative action. It was sanctioned. It was termed essentially a press conference, but they tried to pretend like this was some sort of protest to kind of keep their street cred, to make sure that they appear to look like they're still activists that are actually fighting for us. The problem is all they're asking for is kick the can down the road, kick the can down the road, and just allow a little bit more time. Now we do need more time to allow these funds to be passed out. But the People's Party and a few other activists, myself included, went down to Occupy Congress, and we went down to the US Capitol steps, and we did almost exactly the same type of thing that they did. And none of them tweeted about it, none of them talked about it, none of them mentioned it, and then 4 people were arrested for using a bullhorn on the steps of Congress. Do you see the disparity there? So they said, look at us, we've achieved a landslide victory. Biden has issued a eviction moratorium. Cheer for us, everyone. We are your progressive champions. We're fighting for you. Of course, the courts, the Supreme Court, when they knew this beforehand, struck down that eviction moratorium, and now evictions can continue, and the consolidation of the housing market can continue to move forward. They can kick out the undesirables, put them out on the street, and then they can lock them into a prison because they don't have anywhere to live. More on that in upcoming episodes. We're going to discuss in great detail the prison industry in this country, the way that it is used to create a class of slaves, essentially, and also keep a stranglehold on the poor and the people that step outside the line. They don't just get slapped on the hand, they get beaten with a big fucking stick until they break and comply. Obviously, it didn't work on me. More on that in upcoming episodes. But what are they trying to do? It looks like now they're proposing legislation. They said they were going to force Congress to come back into session. They didn't do that. And they didn't speak out about it after the Supreme Court knocked it down. They didn't speak out in defense of the activists that went to the Capitol. But now they're proposing another 60-day eviction moratorium. We went down there to ask the government to cancel rent. We went down there to ask the government to forgive rent. They should be trying to fight for something like that. These funds that were allocated, they're not being passed out. So let's look into a little bit of why that's the case. About $25 billion in federal money poured into states and cities in February to help renters unable to make payments amid the pandemic, followed by the March approval, another $21.55 billion in Biden's American Rescue Plan. Yet only 3 billion or 6.5% has been distributed to landlords and tenants as of the end of June. That figure has increased substantially in the 6 weeks since, according to state officials, although not fast enough to meet the need. If this many people are struggling to pay their rent, why are they not using these federal funds? It seems like they're just lazy. Is that why? Are they just lazy? Do they want to be homeless? They must want to be homeless. No. It's not just tenants. Landlords are also strained to receive money from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, first funded by Congress in December. Tenants must apply in tandem with their landlords. So if you don't have a mom and pop landlord, which most people don't, to apply for these funds, you have to go through reams of paperwork. And you also have to have your landlord sign off with you. So if your landlord wants to get rid of you, they can just not sign off. Or if they're too busy, or if they're a giant corporation, you may not even be able to get them on the phone, much less get them to sign paperwork with you. So eligible renters, according to federal law, must have experienced a loss income from the pandemic, be at risk of losing their home, and have a household income 80% or below the area's median income. So they means test it. They means test it just like everything else they do. Hey, HBO Max, how you doing, man? Thanks, dude. I appreciate it. So you have to be really, really, really poor to get this rental assistance in the first place. So it doesn't matter if you lost your job. It doesn't matter if they told you to stay at home. It doesn't matter if you got COVID and you got sick and you couldn't work even when you could go back to work. None of that matters because you have to meet this means tested guidelines to even qualify. They put these things behind so many layers of red tape and make them almost impossible for anyone to access. But they can go in front of everyone and get on TV and do the politician thing where they say, look, we tried to help you. Why aren't you taking the money from us? One of six renters is estimated to be behind on their rent, according to the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter if you make more than 80%, right? HBO Max says, or Hobo Max, what if you lost your job not taking the vaccine? That's another problem too, is that a lot of employers now are forcing people to take the vaccine, um, and they could potentially lose their jobs if they don't take it. We've talked about this a little bit on the stream, how the ruling classes want to divide us against each other, and they'll use any opportunity that comes their way to do that. So if they can find a reason to make poor people fight against other poor people, they will take advantage of that. Now it's the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. A lot of people have very valid reasons not to trust their government. A lot of people have very valid reasons not to trust pharmaceutical companies. Look at the opioid crisis. Look at the Oxycontin push. Look at movies like that document real events, things like Dark Waters, these forever chemicals that they put in all of our bloodstreams. Look at Aaron Brockovich. So, not saying that there's a big conspiracy and these vaccines are bad for you, but the problem is mRNA technology has never been used en masse in human beings before. So the fear that people have, the hesitancy to take the vaccine, another reason is just political partisanship. So political partisanship is becoming more and more of the way we communicate now in this country. You're either on one side or the other, and you hate the other side no matter what. People have lost their objectivity, and now we can look back and we can see Biden and Pelosi and Schumer all saying, "Oh, I'm not going to take that vaccine if Donald Trump tells me to take it." Well, what about the other half of the country that voted for Donald Trump that's saying, "Oh, I'm not going to take that vaccine because Biden told me to take it"? The issue has been politicized, and then it doesn't help that we have people like Fauci and other medical experts getting on TV and lying to us from the very beginning of this pandemic and saying that you're not supposed to wear masks and masks don't work. And then, of course, They want everything to go back to normal. They want the economy to keep moving. They want us, go back to work. You go back to work. You fucking plebe. So they say, hey, you got the vaccines? Go ahead, go out, go crazy, take the masks off, go nuts, and then the COVID rate starts to rise and rise and rise again. But anyways, I got derailed. But thanks, Trouble Max, for watching. So several states have gone above what is required by federal law to force tenants to prove they meet the eligible income levels. In some states, including New York, the online portal set up to field applications has been a disaster with regular glitches kicking off users. Does it sound like a little bit like the rollout of Obamacare and how these politicians are so out of touch they can't even set up technology properly? They have so much money and so much funding for war, but at the snap of a finger, they can send billions, trillions of dollars to this conflict or that conflict, and then they can funnel that money through the tax basis of the from the tax basis of the United States into the pockets of Beltway contractors. But when it comes to something like healthcare, which would be a great benefit to our society, instead of making the program universal and avoiding all of the loopholes and the red tape, they decide to means test it because they want to make sure that people are not raised up out of poverty. Just like sending stimulus checks, they said might overheat the economy because there is a global predatory lender class. They want you to take the money from them, like through a credit card, and pay back with 35% interest. Because here in the United States, very few people actually make anything. But there are a lot of Wall Street firms, there's a lot of bankers, and a lot of people that operate just based off of credit. Yeah, I think for me, most credit cards, because my credit score it's not excellent, they're charging like 35% interest. But of course, if you have a lot of money, you can get a 0% interest loan. So several states have gone behind. Okay, so documentation in some states goes beyond what's required. There's this whole narrative, the narrative of like welfare queens. There's this whole narrative of these poor people that are taking advantage of the system and they're a drag on society. I am working on my credit. It's getting a little bit better. But the problem is that the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is complete fucking bullshit. Yes, there is an opportunity to make something more of yourself, but most real wealth is handed down. Um, most real opportunity is given to you by connections that you have. Most often, more often than not, these millionaires and billionaires, they come from wealthy conditions. Yeah, so well, yeah, it's a complicated thing. The problem is it feeds into a narrative that tries to say that our society is fair, that everybody starts on this even playing field. But if you work at a grocery store and you support your family and your kids, whatever your living conditions may have been. Like, let's say you grew up in a poor household, you couldn't afford college, you didn't have enough positive support in your life to encourage you to do the hard work of trying to apply for a scholarship. So let's see. Hold on, you're telling me right now if you blow up on Twitch and become big, you didn't do that yourself. I'm confused. Yeah, I mean, I work. I have a job. I'm not doing this to make money. And I did eventually learn a trade, which has afforded me a more comfortable lifestyle than I lived for most of my life. Um, but I had support. I had family. So a lot of people come from broken homes. A lot of people come from poor neighborhoods. A lot of people come from neighborhoods where the schools look more like prisons. Neighborhoods that are where there's drugs and addiction and all kinds of real societal ills and issues all around them. And the government does very little to help improve those conditions. They're more interested in just serving the needs of their donor class. Um, so I didn't pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I had a lot of help. I had a lot of help from family. I had a lot of help from organizations and places that provided services to me to help me to grow up as a human being and to fight things like drug addiction. So back to the let's see, but everyone has to accuse to those other than family. Yeah, I'm not sure where what you're saying. I'll get back into the chat, but so documentation in some states goes beyond what's required. So through June 36, states had spent less than 10% of the federal funds they'd received, even though the first infusion of funds came in February. So why are they not passing out the funds that they allocated to help people pay their rent, people that could not afford to pay their rent? The South Carolina state legislature didn't take action to begin the program until April, delaying a formal launch until May, which meant applicants weren't accepted until June. Like I said before, there is very little resistance when it comes to bailouts for banks and rich corporations. There's very little resistance when it comes to helping out the haves, and very much resistance when it comes to helping out the have nots. So states didn't even start to implement these systems until very late. So in New York, it says in the article, nowhere has the emergency rental assistance program been more scrutinized in New York, which until July hadn't gotten any money to renters or landlords. The state now says it distributed more than 100 million all since July, representing 3.8% of its 2.6 billion federal allotment. Now, why am I bringing this up now? Why do I keep going back to this issue? Well, there's a deadline coming up. Under federal rules, the Treasury Department can reallocate emergency funds that states and cities haven't spent by September 30 to high performing jurisdictions that have distributed at least 65% of their aid. So, most of the counties, most of the places in this country where people probably need the help the most, just don't have as many resources as a state like New York City. So they're going to strip that funding from them, which whether through the landlords resisting because they just want to kick out the tenants so that they can raise the rent, so that they can rent to someone with more money. Maybe they have issues with their tenants for whatever reasons. Landlords are actually refusing these funds. 38,000 applicants representing 460 million in payouts have received preliminary approval, but the state lacks the signature of their landlord. Why are the landlords not signing off on 38,000 applications? Well, one thing is the myth of the mom and pop landlord. What if landlords tried to kick us out, but we all said no with guns for defense? It seems like in this country, the stark divisions between classes are becoming worse and worse and worse. And they are ignoring the humanitarian needs of their citizens in favor of their own prestige, their own power, their own wealth, and their own influence. And they're out of touch. They have no connection to the poor. They have no connection to the people who they always champion and claim to help, like the working class man. So, what's going to happen is the working class is going to have to stand up. We're going to have to mobilize with each other. And we're going to have to ignore all the propaganda that tells us to hate each other. So, under federal rules, the Treasury Department can reallocate emergency funds. So, September 30th is coming up. That's in 8 days. In 8 days, most of this funding is going to go right back to the federal government. And this is funding that they did not want to hand out in the first place. They craft these types of relief packages in such a way that make it almost impossible for anyone to access it. But like in the 2008 housing crisis, why didn't they craft those bills in a way where they can oversee the funds that were sent to these companies who still raised the bonuses for their CEOs? Companies that made bad business decisions. So this goes towards that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps. In this country, there is socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. So why didn't they put all of this red tape all over the funds that they handed out after they gambled on the housing market and the bubble finally popped? They didn't do that because those are their friends. Those are the classes that they feel comfortable with. Those are the people that they sit down at fancy restaurants with and talk to. They're not the unclean, unwashed masses. So they don't prosecute anyone. They let them get off scot free. They create mechanisms to pass massive, massive amounts of cash infusions into these companies that made bad business decisions, and they prosecuted nobody. And then the same exact thing happened with the CARES Act. Instead, although this time it was a coronavirus epidemic. So this time it was through no fault of their own. Economies were just shut down. But still, they cry and complain about people taking advantage of the system when it comes to handing out crumbs to the poor, while it's just a matter of course to pass out massive amounts of money to the rich. Bobby Wilkinson, executive director of Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, said Texas bypassed a traditional procurement process through a waiver by Republican Governor Greg Abbott that allowed Texas to hire a vendor to oversee the program in February and launch a website with the same months before many other states. So in Texas, they hired someone to set up this website because the state government and even our federal government, they are always terrible at setting up websites online. I don't know why. I don't know if it's by design or it's just their incompetence. They're probably still using old computers from the 1980s in a lot of these offices. So they are falling behind partly because the systems that they put into place are just inaccessible to people. Like even if people fill out all of this paperwork and put all their applications in online, they can't even process through these websites because they're designed so poorly. So Texas got out ahead of most people, and they're handing out most of the funds. But Texas is another large economy, so they already have a lot of resources. Landlords skirt COVID-19 eviction bans using intimidation and tricks to boot tenants. So these are some of the tactics that they've used: changing locks, cutting off utility service, refusing to make repairs, making threats, providing misinformation, and any other creative way to accuse someone of a lease violation that fits an exception in the moratorium. Landlords, they told state agencies, hiked rents even as their tenants lost their jobs and missed utility bill payments, so they're still raising rents during this COVID crisis. They skipped out on basic maintenance and let conditions deteriorate, leaving renters a choice between leaving on their own or living on their own. USA Today can't even write or spell check their documents. Or living with mold outbreaks or infestations of bed bugs, roaches, and maggots. So, Stack, the mother of a 15-year-old daughter with disabilities, came up short in April on her $850 rent. Her lease was up, but she assumed she could renew it. Instead, she came home to the notice to vacate in the middle of a fucking pandemic where you're told to lock down in your home and not pay you can't pay your bills because you can't go to work. She said, I was devastated, I was confused and crying, and I felt like I was having a panic attack. I lost my job, and now I had to basically beg someone to let us live somewhere else instead of a homeless shelter. So these things are going on while gigantic corporations were given a massive transfusion of wealth. And what are they doing with that money? Well, some of them are trying to corner the housing market. And then we see all of this propaganda. Renting is terrible, owning is worse. Forget owning. Renting is becoming the end game for many millennials and baby boomers. Why millennials are renting more and why it works for them. So Cori Bush and Elizabeth Warren are putting a performative bill in front of the Congress that will just impose another 60-day eviction moratorium. So in, I don't know, when was the CARES Act passed? About a year or so, less than 10% of the federal aid has been handed out, while more than 6 million people are behind on their rent. And why is that? It's because of the red tape that is put into place, because giving poor people money is always a very complicated task, while giving the rich money is easy as snapping your fucking fingers. So renting is not wasted money, why you shouldn't be in a rush to buy a home. So the gigantic corporations that fund our mass media, our mainstream media, that fund both the GOP and the DNC are are very competent at putting out a massive amount of propaganda when they want to accomplish something. What they're trying to accomplish now is to buy as many houses as they can and to push the housing market prices so high that people can't afford houses, to get people to sell their homes so that they can make them permanent rentals. And it's not just Blackstone that's doing this. So Carol Roth said in response to Shapiro's arrogant comment, "You shouldn't have to compete with BlackRock to buy your home. The Fed's cheap flood of money sells Main Street out to Wall Street. This is the war on the little guy. This is war on small business. This is central planning's ultimate nefarious plan." Nefarious plans indeed. Once again, while Main Street suffers, Wall Street is making more money than ever before. During the lockdowns, which we know now had no link to reduced mortality, billionaires became $10 trillion richer, while the poor and middle class were decimated. Over 60% of small businesses were closed forever. The wealth of the middle class was wiped out, and Americans were shoved further into the cul-de-sac of labor. So the person that was in my into the chat room, I am 100% anti-capitalist. Yes. So it's just obvious that it's not working. Thank you, Novelli MYT. Thank you for joining the stream. The profit motive doesn't take into account humanitarian issues, and a society is not a corporation because a society is full of many different types of people, from different backgrounds, different circumstances, different socioeconomic conditions. And running a business where the profit motive is the only incentive is not the same as running a country where the health and well-being of the population should be the number one goal. Just as the World Economic Forum correctly predicted the pandemic as well as the cyber attacks, the Great Reset to our economy was accurately predicted as well. The true reset to the American economy is in fact underway, and by the end of it, Americans will own less than they ever have before. The Davos 2021 World Economic Forum occurred on January 25th with more than 1,200 delegates from 60 countries participating in the virtual event. The Great Reset was the theme of the Unique Twin Summit. In their 9 predictions for the future economy, the World Economic Forum predicts that by 2030 you will own nothing and you will be happy. And that anything you want or need you will simply rent from a mega corporation. That is the perfect society that people like Bill Gates, people like Jeff Bezos, people like Joe Biden. That is the perfect society that they see, where corporations own every service and you pay a premium to survive, where the slim mechanisms that once existed to quote unquote pull yourself up by your bootstraps were achievable in decades past, they are being stripped from us every day. So there's your update on the eviction crisis, and there is your update on the state of predatory capitalism in our grand United States of America. So say hello to your new landlord, Wall Street. This is Question Authority, and I'll be back, and we're going to be looking at the criminal justice system. Thanks, guys. Peace, not war. Have a good evening.